Okay, so welcome everyone to this this monthly wing talk. Before we get to the talk, I'd just like to mention that today we will be using polls and questions. So everybody has a sort of polls tab and a questions tab. So once we get to that, I'd just like everyone to know that they can put in new questions into the questions box. And once we get to the quick Q&A session, if anyone would like to have their audio or have their webcam visible, just let me know and we can arrange that. So yes, let's get to the talk. So today we're very lucky to have Helen Robinson talking to us on geothermal development in Africa. So Helen has specialised as a hydrogeologist and has extensive experience in geothermal research and industry, and is currently regional manager for Africa at the International Geothermal Association, IGA. Helen is also a super long-term member of Wing UK and has pretty much been here from the beginning. So yeah, so those are just a few of her many accolades. Without further ado, let's get to Helen.
Thanks, Simran, and thanks everyone for joining us today. For those of you who do know me, you'll know that I'm a bit of a nut when it comes to geothermal on the African continent. I'm very passionate about geothermal across the African continent. And I just wanted to share a bit more about what's going on the continent, because we all really focus in on what's going on in Kenya, and rightly so. They are leading the way across the continent, but the continent has so much more to offer us. And so I just wanted to touch upon some of that today, and a little bit of a delve into sort of a bit more of the sustainability aspect of geothermal as well. So a quick overview. So as I said, geothermal overview of Africa. So what's going on the continent, bit on sustainable development and SDG 7, and linking specifically geothermal with human development. A couple of examples of the positive impact that geothermal has, and hopefully sort of get your thoughts rolling on, you know, what else we could be doing. A summary of some of the barriers that we see across the African continent, which actually is probably repeated in many other localities around the world. And very briefly touch upon the IGA in Africa as well. So there's lots of pictures. Actually, I should probably say as well, my apologies, that Africa image there is the continent separated into its 5 main regions, and the regions and the countries within those regions are defined by the World Bank. Any eagle eyes amongst you there will actually notice that according to World Bank, Djibouti, which is this little tiny pink bit here, if you can see my cursor, is actually grouped with North Africa. Now, it's not North Africa, but North Africa is actually grouped with the Middle East, so it's MENA, Middle East and North Africa, and so they actually group Djibouti with the Middle East. However, from a geological perspective, it's much more sort of rift. So this has been grouped. This helps the IGA manage basically what we have is 54 sovereign states and territories across the continent, which also includes 5 small island developing states as well. So yeah, lots of pictures. So this one is Lake Naivasha in Kenya, looking across to Mount Eburu in the distance there. And so an overview. Well, before we get into an overview, I'm going to do a little poll. I'm not going to give too much away right now. This is sort of a bit of a curiosity thing, and the outcomes vary depending on you know, sort of who I'm speaking to at the time. So I'd be really interested if you could go to the poll and select your answer. You should have 1 of 5 to say, what do you think is the dominant geothermal play for the East African rift system? And I'll give you a few minutes to do that. And then Ollie, I don't know if you can hear me, whether you're able to quickly let me know what the percents are.
So they're still coming in. So give it probably, it's only going for 40 seconds. So
Yeah,
we'll
no,
wait a
that's
little bit
fine.
more. But it looks like at the moment there is a bias towards, actually I won't say what the bias is, otherwise it might bias the results more.
So some people are probably on this call who've done this question before, and it also depends on what people's backgrounds are, and, you know, whether you're a geologist or a policymaker or financier or anything like that. So it's quite varied to see what people say, or what people's perceptions are.
We're still collecting some. We'll go for another 10 seconds, let's say, and then we're at 70% of people have voted. So
Okay.
Give it till 1 minute 30 and then I'll close. So 5 seconds, quick. Right. So it's 46% extensional domain type, 29% volcanic, 21% plutonic, and 4% orogenic.
Okay, great. Ooh, it's supposed to happen. Right, okay, so those of you, the 46% of you who selected extensional, you are correct. So this is the current play catalogue, and the geothermal play is basically just determined by the control of heat and fluid migration in the subsurface, focusing mainly on convective and conductive processes. And so within the Rift Valley, fluid and heat migrates through the subsurface because of the intense faulting and fracturing that we see within the rift, but the heat source is the volcanic. So it's actually a hybrid system, and most of our geothermal plays are hybrid systems. They're not dominated by one or the other, but you can see the 6 end members essentially here. And we used a lot of reference to sort of the code which the Australians developed. There's characterization, or sort of, you know, how we characterize our resource based on the exergy method, so water's capability to do work. And we use a lot of reference to the whole low, intermediate, or mid, and then high enthalpy systems. But when you look at the literature regarding that last one, the temperatures specifically that relate to low, intermediate, and high overlap depending on which author you're referring to. And also all of these methods are quite often related to post drilling. So you have to have done some subsurface invasive work before you can start looking at this. And so the idea that Moak and Birdsmore had with this was, can we use geology to give us an idea of what we might expect? And we kind of used a similar approach in the oil and gas sector. So in the oil and gas sector, they use geophysics to image the subsurface as we would, and then they would interpret that to say, well, there's our fault, that's going to be our fluid pathway, or there's our lithology that's likely to be our hydrocarbon source rock, there's our clay cap. So they're looking at the geology in the subsurface and what they can gain from surface knowledge to ascertain what we might actually expect to see. Which is a really good way to approach, but it's not the be all and end all, and there's a lot more to it. But if we focus on Africa and we look at the volcanics, so we're focusing initially on the volcanics because, you know, we still have that stereotype in many parts of the world that geothermal is volcanics. So on this plot here, the grey triangles are those volcanic centres that are thought to have last erupted pre-Holocene and are probably extinct. So note probably, from a hazards perspective, probably. The heat directly associated with these volcanics is likely to be residual and low, but it doesn't mean we cannot try and utilise them. And then the coloured triangles there represent the volcanoes that have a Holocene record of eruptions. You can see there sort of the different geological settings that they occur in and the crustal thicknesses. And while these centres have a recent record, it doesn't mean that they are classified as active. And the GVP, the Global Volcanism Programme, state that active volcanoes have erupted in the last 10,000 years. The term extinct is used less, and it's now probably extinct. So the phrase is probably extinct, as there have been several recent examples of eruptions from volcanoes that were once thought to be extinct based on the 10,000 year threshold set by GVP. And any of our audience that are in sort of certainly the East African region may be aware of the Mayotte volcanic crisis that happened in 2018, if I recall correctly, where Mayotte, which is not on this map, it's French overseas territory, but forms part of the Comoros archipelago. That volcano was thought to be extinct, and then in 2018 was associated with a submarine volcanic eruption that is actually the largest submarine volcanic eruption on record, and that was from a volcano we thought was extinct. But what you can see from this, see here, the volcanic systems associated heat in several localities with little to no consideration for geothermal being made. So you've got lots of volcanics there throughout the East African rift system, so loads throughout Ethiopia and Kenya for the eastern branch, and then the Rwanda branch of the Virunga National Park there as well, and the couple that are in Democratic Republic of Congo. But you can see the Cameroon volcanic chain, so along through here. So got volcanics here, now they're blue, so they're potentially they could still be active. And then we've got quite a few popping up that are potentially still active right across the sort of Sahara region, and then also in Madagascar, and then we have Comoros and Cape Verde, and then down here we have Prince Edward and Marion Islands. Excuse me. So understanding what type of geothermal plays there are and where they are located across the continent can provide a very quick assessment of what we might expect to see, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of the geology of the sea, the potential geothermal outputs, and especially with heat related outputs, where they lie in relation to populated areas and therefore your heat customer. This is presented at a country scale and it's still a work in progress. But the aim is towards a more detailed approach over time. So we'll likely, you will likely notice multiple dominant plays are observable in individual countries. The countries, you know, many of the African countries are huge. They're not dominated by one play. It just depends on where you are within the geology of that region. So South Africa, I've got there in red. Now, South Africa does not have volcanics on its mainland, but as I mentioned earlier, Prince Edward and the Marion Islands have a high temperature resource that could be utilized for electricity. So that's these little islands down here. The islands are not inhabited and they're not thought to have any environmental significance, but the distance of transmission, the distance is around 1,200 miles, sorry, across the southern oceans is going to be a real issue. The closest analogue to Prince Edward and Marion is Iceland, and then Cape Verde, which is up here, and Comoros, which is here. The closest analogue to those two from a geological perspective is Hawaii. But they are your volcanic field type plays. And then based on recent updated geological maps of the African continent, so this is sort of a lot of work that's been done by the French Geological Survey. These are the countries that have significant plutonic type geology in their shallow subsurface, none of which are repeated in the previously displayed volcanic plays, apart from South Africa, where you're looking at South Africa having plutonic plays on its mainland as opposed to offshore. The first step challenge with these localities is knowing if the plutonic rocks are K-type or I-type. So that is a high potassium, high radiogenic heat from the decay of certain feldspar and mica minerals. I've spent recently quite a lot of time in South Africa, and I know that their Limpopo granites and their Cape granites are K-type, so they're high potassium, therefore high radiogenic heat potential. And so there is an opportunity to utilize their plutonic play for heat, if not power as well, depending on what we're seeing in the subsurface and whether that fits into a binary or ORC technology. So with the exception of the East African Rift system, which has largely been confirmed and we've also already discussed as dominated by extensional processes, so that includes the countries of Eritrea, Djibouti, Ethiopia, Kenya and northern Tanzania that makes up the eastern branch of the Rift system. and then Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, southern Tanzania, and Malawi, and actually to some extent the Democratic Republic of Congo as well, that makes up the western branch. The remaining countries that have been identified as likely being influenced by extensional plays are determined from the earthquake risk map for the African continent, and that is assuming that there is heat flow, structural permeability, and these extensional zones still have some kind of activity going on. And then moving on, so we have these ones here, so intracratonic basin type, and actually we probably find that Sudan's got quite a bit as well. And then finally your orogenic, so we've got alpine orogenic geology up here. And as of yet, I haven't found any literature on anything that's specifically basement type on the African continent. Doesn't mean to say it's not there or it forms part of a hybrid, but this is where we're at the moment. So installed capacity across Africa. What we've got here is a map that shows you which countries are already utilising geothermal. Understandably, Kenya is the only one with installed capacity for electricity. Now, Ethiopia does at Oluta Langano, but as of the IGA geothermal database of last year, this is temporarily unoperational, and I know Oluta have been having some challenges as well. So actively at the moment, we have Kenya with 985 megawatts of electricity, and when phase 2 of Menengai goes online at some point this year, they will hit the 1 gigawatt club as well. And then the rest of the countries that are currently utilising geothermal is purely for heat, and it's for a range of applications: health, tourism, food security, and some heating and cooling of buildings are the predominant ones. But what else is going on across the African continent? So we have the ones that we've already discussed with respect to Ethiopia and Kenya. But as you can see there, we've got quite a lot of activity going on right across the African continent. And so Tanzania and Djibouti, drilling and exploration, so they're in yellow. Exploration and feasibility is in the bright pink. So we have got Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Botswana, and Namibia coming across here. And we also then have Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda, and Uganda, as well as Eritrea. We've also got here in blue power and heat to be, and actually it's cooling as well, to be commissioned in 2024. So later on this year, Zambia will be commissioning their first geothermal power station. So it's electricity, so it will be the first geothermal electricity power station outside of the Rift Valley on the African continent. And there's a range of other things going on there, lots of heat applications being invested in and already actively supplying to their heat needs in those countries. So looking at sustainable development, SDG 7, clean energy for all. Africa has a big focus on electricity generation from all sources, and rightly so. Last figures are over 600 million without access to electricity, so that's from the International Energy Agency, and over almost 1 billion, so 990 million, without access to clean cooking. So there's no denying that electricity is a desperate need. But when you get into rural communities and remote communities and take the time to understand daily life, and it can quite often be a different story. Yes, they want power, but they're also really concerned about other aspects and needs on a day-to-day basis. And so we need to remember the whole UN pledge of leave no one behind. So sustainable development, I've got a definition there from the Britannia Dictionary, but we do find that it lacks a single detailed and widely accepted definition. So it varies depending on where you're looking or who you're talking to. And as a general approach to human development, it's frequently understood to encompass most of, if not all, of the following goals, ideals, and values. So a global perspective on social, economic, and environmental policies, recognition of the instrumental value of a sound natural environment, protection and appreciation of the needs of indigenous cultures, cultivation of economic and social equity, and the responsible and transparent implementation of government policies. And we're pretty good, I think, in the geothermal sector at doing this, but it is variable. And then climate and sustainable development. So we often get the development of energy to reduce greenhouse gases and sustainable development blurred. And we need to remind ourselves that the development of clean energy sources for the mitigation of climate change and the development of clean energy for sustainable energy access for all, while overlapping, are two different things. And we also need to remember that different sustainable development goals have different emphases or urgencies depending on where in the world we are at the time. So every year the United Nations holds a high-level political forum which focuses on a selection of different SDGs and takes a detailed deep dive into each one, producing a range of associated outputs. Now 2021 to 2023 in various aspects focused on SDG 7, along with a few selected others that either directly linked or did not. Excuse me. And you can see the 4 reports that came out over that time frame there. And you can see there that we've got SDG 7 in Africa, SDG 7 for small island nations, and then linkages between SDG 7 and other SDGs. Now that's looking at the role of renewable energies and how they can contribute to addressing the needs and the targets set out by the UN Sustainable Development Goals, but it's energy as a whole. And so we are starting to work at the IGA towards, sorry, before I go on to that, so the output was this final report towards a rescue plan for people and planet. So the those 4 reports culminated in this one. And a few of the take homes. So first of all, more people than ever have access to electricity, but the pace is lagging for least developed countries, which it's probably fair to say that we're innately aware that this is the case. At the current pace, a quarter of the population in Africa specifically will be using unsafe and inefficient cooking systems by 2030. So inefficiency can be sort of related specifically to energy inefficiency, but unsafe quite often relates to the kind of fuels that are being used for cooking, and where they're using those fuels indoor and the ventilation may be really poor, and so there's a lot of health issues related to that as well. And then also renewable energy use is growing in the electricity sector, but limited in heating and transport. I'm like, hello, heating, you know, big flags there, heating and geothermal. A strong rebound is needed to recharge energy efficiency targets. International public financing for clean energy in developing countries continues to decline. So as it stands at the moment, about 5% of global public funding for energy goes to the global south, and 1.5 of that makes its way onto the African continent. So there's a real issue there. We're trying to encourage the African continent to develop energy, regardless of its source, for electricity and for clean cooking. And we're trying to guide them in the direction of a more cleaner, sustainable energy future. And when you speak to many people from different countries across Africa, they're really enthusiastic about renewable green energy and getting energy as a whole. But we're not going to be able to, or they're not going to be able to develop their resources, whatever that resource is, whatever that source is, if we're only getting 1.5% of public financing into the continent for energy development. And then finally, renewable energy is booming in developing countries, but the least developed are falling behind. And that kind of touches upon the issues with financing. So following that report, that last one that I mentioned, where the UN published a report that looked at linking SDG 7 as an entirety, energy entirety, with the other sustainable development goals. One of the things that the IGA is really working on at the moment is looking into linking specifically geothermal and its role with the other sustainable development goals. And some of them are quite easy to do. They're quite common. We've come across some of the aspects of what we're doing to address SDGs and where geothermal sits in that. And some of them are a little bit more challenging to find the information and the linkages that we're hoping to see. So if we start with the Human Development Goals of SDG 1 through 6, and then 7 is also a Human Development SDG. And we look at some of the key priorities. Now, as it is at the moment, the IGA is not looking at SDG 1 ending in poverty in all forms everywhere. And the reason for that is if we look at this underlined word here, resources. So access to sustainable livelihoods, access to resources, social services, and so on and so on. And then coming down here where we're supporting empowerment, disproportionate impact on women and children. When you look at that statement there, the next 5 SDGs almost address that. And so what we're hoping is when we address 2 through 6, we will be able to answer where geothermal sits with respect to SDG 1. And so ending hunger, SDG 2, food security, improving nutrition, and promoting sustainable agriculture. We're all familiar with greenhouses, so this is sort of where geothermal fits into this, but also there are many other food-related aspects, so sort of pasteurization or powdering of milk, creating feed for cattle. What else have we got? Grain drying, so that sort of fits as the feed, and fish farming, and many other applications that can be creating more greener food systems and food security. And then of course that links into jobs, and if if your children have got a better diet, they'll focus better at school or their daily chores, or quite often in rural communities it is the women and children who are collecting the water, collecting the fuel, handling the food, and the general running of the household. But if they are generally doing that, and then we are able to provide them with greenhouses or grain drying, then the women become empowered because it'll be the women running them. It'll be small community businesses and things like that. So SDG 3, so ensuring health and promoting well-being. So most of us are probably quite familiar with sort of the benefits of having a good dip in a geothermal spa. Mineral-rich waters are incredibly good for the skin. The warm waters are good for the soul, very calming and relaxing. But there are other things that we sort of maybe want to start thinking about. I mean, some of the health and well-being feeds into good nutrition, so that takes us back to SDG 2. But there are other things that we can think about as well. So rural communities and maternity wards that may need heat for newborn babies, or hot water, or cooling for refrigeration of vaccinations and medicines and things like that. And electricity can feed into that too, but geothermal potentially has a role in that space also. And then ensuring inclusion with respect to education. So there was a study done in Malawi a couple of years ago that focused on water and water collection. And a lot of the drinking water points, the water well points that were being utilised for various reasons were a significant distance away from communities. It might be that that's where they were installed. It might be that the ones that were closer by were no longer functional. And it was found that where women in particular didn't have to go as far to collect the water, so they weren't spending as much time on that specific daily chore, and they've therefore had more time to spend with their children. Their children were more engaged with general life activities. They would learn more. Granted, they may not have access to school, but they were learning more from a sort of social skills perspective and life skills perspective, because the parents, or the mothers at least, had more time to spend with the children because they weren't out collecting water. And so geothermal might be able to contribute to that. As I go back to, if we're able to empower women to run small businesses that relate to geothermal, and whether that is going back to SDG 2 and the food security side of it, or whether there are other things that we can think about. So for example, there are communities in Jordan that use both geothermal heat and mineralization to create sort of beauty products. And the women run that as their business. They're using geothermal minerals, so that then feeds into health. It gives them some kind of employment and empowerment, and then feeds into education as well. And then SDG 5, equality and empowerment of women and girls. We've kind of touched upon that, I guess, to some extent, where geothermal can contribute to addressing some of the challenges and targets set by the UN for SDG 5. And then SDG 6, water and sanitation. So probably one of the biggest roles that geothermal will have, where we're able to generate power, is going to be the desalination of water, because desalination processes are incredibly energy intensive, but also water is becoming a highly stressed commodity, because it is becoming a commodity. And so geothermal can fit into that, but also, you know, from our geothermal brines, there are certain nutrients that we can extract and utilize in other spaces as well. So nutrients for agriculture and things like that. And so there's lots of interlinks. And then, of course, when you start thinking of geothermal and food security, you then start not just addressing options for employment, but also, I think it's SDG 8 that is sustainable communities and cities, but that also covers disaster risk reduction. And so if we're able to provide food security in some capacity through geothermal, we don't necessarily have to worry quite so much when there is a drought, a disaster, because we are reducing, we're sort of reducing the risk of the impact of that disaster if we're able to address food security in an alternative way. So looking at some impact examples, so last week I visited a geothermal site in Zambia. So I mentioned earlier on that the power station will be commissioned later on this year. And it's an incredibly good example of how geothermal should be approached on the continent, where it's focusing on the community. Now, it's a vast area. The license area covers 14,000 square kilometers, and this is just a tiny little area of it, and this is part of a national park. They've done everything, so they've got 21 wells drilled, and you can't see the wells even at the wellhead, because they blend into the environment. So that was a key thing from an infrastructure perspective, is that everything blends into the environment because it's on the edge of a national park. They've done a lot of work to build long-lasting relationships and trust with the community from the off. So the team have installed water wells for community drinking water. So for no other purpose, not related to geothermal, not related to monitoring, nothing like that, just so that the communities in the area have access to drinking water that's much closer. They've repaired dams for rainwater harvesting that is water supplies for the cattle. And they've set up a milk collection point in the nearest village, so that the farmers can deliver their milk for cool storage and shipment to the wholesalers. Now, milk in Zambia is often diluted with water, or it has powder added to it, and actually there are examples where antibiotics have also been added, or it's even sold sour. So there is a policy at this water collection point, and so the company are very sort of, you know, we need good quality produce, that the milk at this point must be fresh and it's tested to check that it is, which is encouraging the community to take ownership of making sure that the produce they are providing is of a good quality. And this also is providing employment locally. The land management structure in this area typically involves national park lands, wildlife management land, and then traditional lands. And the good relationships that they've built upon are really important in this area. So the geothermal wells and the power plant are just inside the national park, and normally around the outside you'll have wildlife management, and then around that you'll have traditional lands. But this national park, they don't have the wildlife management, so you're going straight from national park into traditional lands. And basically you need a good relationship with the communities, because the chief of this particular community, and this is applicable right across Zambia and I'm sure other parts of the African continent, they can give you a sort of, yes, you can use the land for XYZ, but if you don't have that in writing and leases signed and all of that kind of thing, they can ask you to leave with next to no notice, and there's very little you can do with it. So building these really good relationships with these communities when we're working in areas like this is incredibly important. And leases of land use do not come overnight. The geothermal development itself is, or it will be a tri-generation, so power, heating and cooling. And it's all being developed based around the community needs of cattle herding and cattle related products. So milk will be pasteurized and powdered using heat and power. Where it isn't powdered, it will be kept cool. There is an agreement with the farmers that across 35 hectares of agricultural land nearby, they will grow sunflowers rather than maize. Not only is this a more drought resistant crop, so they're more likely to have a successful crop, but the oil will be extracted from the seeds and sold as sunflower oil, and that's using the geothermal heat and power. And then the husks will be used for cattle feed, meaning the feed is made on site, so that makes it much cheaper, and the CO2 footprint of that is lower, as they don't need to drive the feed 5 hours from Lusaka as well. And there are further plans to use geothermal cooling in an abattoir and heat for hide drying. There's also an agreement to reintroduce biodiversity to the national park, bringing tourism through a spa facility. And this is just phase 1, and this will be 3 phases of community level geothermal, up to 15 megawatts, and they will also be selling some of that to the grid as well, which is really important in Zambia because they are currently in a drought, as many African nations are, and they are having 12 hours a day of load shedding because the hydro system, which is their base load, cannot cope with demand because of the increasing drought, which is something we're going to see growing across many of the global south countries moving forward as climate extremes become more frequent. So these are some of the pictures from the site. So we're doing some well testing, looking at rocks. I was very happy to be back in the field. These are some of the, so just one example of the course. So like I said, they've got 21 wells and they've got core for all wells for the entire depth of those wells. And you can see down here some nice indicators of permeability. This is one of the wells. This is going to be their first production well. So this was a discharge, and the guy's putting the discharge infrastructure together. You can see that, you probably can't see it there, but that's the sort of temperature. So this is about a 900-meter well, if I remember correctly, and they're getting 108 degrees Celsius at the moment, and that is restricted as well. So that's a 4-inch valve, 2-inch pipe, restricted flow, so they can increase the temperature and the flow rate with that. And then this is their milk collection point tank that they've had installed. So this is a 2,000-litre tank, which is collected and sent to wholesaler every 18 hours. And they started off collecting about 200 litres a day, and they're now turning people away because they fill, excuse me, they fill the 2,000 litres and don't have enough space. So they're actually looking to invest in larger tanks for this purpose. So moving on as well, excuse me a second. The Assyrian story. So for those of you who are not familiar, Assyrian is in Kenya, and it is an award-winning flower farm that taps into the geothermal wells at Olkaria. So you're using the heat from the wells, and as you can see there, they have a solar farm as well. So their electricity is solar. So that's one of the heat plants there. And basically they are completely green, they are completely off-grid, combining geothermal heat and solar electricity for all of their needs. So that's another heat plant as well. And this heat plant here will also be connected to a fish farm next door. So one of the rows is greenhouses, so they're using the geothermal heat to maintain the temperature. The flowers are award-winning. They are shipped daily around the world. And the project employs 3,500 people within the Naivasha area of Kenya. So just let that one finish. So we've got sort of industry, green industry, completely off-grid, completely independent, and generating quite a significant amount of employment through that, and the recognition that their flowers are award-winning and some of the roses only grow in these conditions. And then the next slide is a little video. It's about 8 minutes long, so hopefully you'll all stick with me. And it's for the direct use cascade project in Menengai, a demonstration project. So I'm going to stop talking for a minute and let you watch this one.
Helen, can you hear me? It looks like there's no sound coming in.
Oh, it might be my settings. Okay, sorry about that. Sorry, it might be my settings, and I'm not sure how I change it, so I'll leave it. But basically, it was a little tour around the direct use cascade system at Menengai. So basically, they have a well. So it's at well pad 3 for those of you who are familiar. Well 3 is not discharging at the moment, but they're bringing the heat and the steam from a different well, which is around 100 degrees, goes through a heat exchanger. It's quite a simple heat exchanger, no fancy sort of technology or anything. And then the heat is transferred at around 87 degrees to a small milk pasteurizing facility. It sort of takes some of the heat out of it and cascades down at 60 degrees. And then goes into a laundry facility. The laundry extracts some of the heat, so it cascades down at a lower temperature. And then they've got grain drying, which is 55 degrees in greenhouses. Now, the fluid in the greenhouses is 55 degrees when it goes through the pipes, but as it dissipates into the greenhouses itself, it's around sort of 23 degrees. And they aim to maintain that temperature between 18 and 23. And then the lowest end temperature, the water's about 40 degrees, and they add in cool water to bring it down to 29, which is the optimal temperature for the fish species. And bring fish in at hatchery size. And whilst when they grow, they use that as food for the Menengai camp for the workers. While those fish are growing, they are producing a byproduct. So they extract the byproduct and then remove certain nutrients, so ammonia, for example, phosphates, nitrates, and use that as fertilizer in the greenhouses as well. And they can get about 900 tomato plants in the greenhouse and produces sort of 3 to 4 tons of tomatoes per crop. And because it's not seasonal, they could potentially get sort of maybe 3 crops a year out of that. So that's an awful lot of produce, and it's completely organic produce. A lot of people question, you know, why in Kenya do you need to use geothermal heat in a greenhouse? But at the equator, the daytime temperatures are really quite warm, and nighttime it's quite cool. And because you've got water to feed the crops, when the temperature drops, you run the risk of getting condensation. And so maintaining the temperature between 18 and 23 degrees all of the time means that you don't get condensation, which means you don't get fungus infection. It limits insect infestations, but they also have additional things in place to mitigate any insects that do happen to get into the greenhouse. And it just makes an all-round more successful story with respect to food crops in geothermal greenhouses. So 6 major barriers. I'll be very quick because I realise we're actually getting a bit late. So limited awareness of geothermal beyond the rift. We still have that stereotype around the volcanic systems. Capacity to deliver is a big issue across Africa. Even when you speak to the likes of the MD for Geothermal Development Company, they will even say that they don't have the capacity to deliver using modern technologies and modern methods because they are limited on their capability to upskill. Local political and environmental opposition. Lack of transparency is really quite a big one. Policy and legislation around land use, around resettlement assistance programs, environmental baselines, and then high early stage risk for finances, which is something that we see regardless of where we are around the world. And then finally, IGA in Africa. So actually, I'm not going to go into too much detail regarding the IGA in Africa, because on the 18th of April, myself and Dr. Marek Brommer, who's our CEO, will be presenting on Europe and Africa for this presentation as well. So you can go on to the Geological Society Northern Ireland page on LinkedIn and register for that talk if you are interested and haven't already done so. And that's me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you so much for such an insightful talk into sustainable development goals and its relation specifically into local positive impacts for geothermal, which I suppose I knew about, but not in such detail. So I've learned a lot. I'm just going to look at the questions, and I think there is one question, but I have to. I'm struggling to see it because it's such a small box on my screen. Just okay, there's another one coming in, but I can't see them. Just annoying.
Would you like me to read them, Simran?
Yes, please, Ollie, because
yes. Are the geothermal projects predominantly open loop or closed loop, or a mixture? And the second question, do the open loop projects also use mineral recovery, e.g. lithium, to help improve the economics? From Scott McNeil.
So Kenya, most of the sites in Kenya are open loop. There is one, and they're all flash apart from one. So Olkaria has, I think it's Ormat's binary. They have a binary plant there, but they're all open loop. And the Zambia example will also be open loop. They are starting to look into mineral extraction, but what you will find, you referred specifically to lithium, is lithium in brines you only tend to find occurs either where you have significant deposits of ignimbrite. So yes, we've got lots of volcanics across East Africa, but if you don't have an ignimbrite, silicic ignimbrite, you're unlikely to see economically viable levels of lithium. And also lithium has been associated with carbonate reservoirs as well. And again, we don't really see, certainly in East Africa, we don't really see much in the way of carbonates. And there are some carbonates in Zambia, but the lithium concentrations there as at the moment with the phase 1 wells that they've got, again, is not yet economically viable. But again, it's raising the awareness of this idea of co-production. It's still quite new in many parts of the world. Oil and gas sector kind of jumping on it a little bit in America particularly. So there's a lot of work going on in Texas, and I see Jackson Grimes has joined us, so he'll be very familiar with some of that work. But at the moment in Africa, we are very limited as to what's going on, and it's a very new concept to look at mineral extraction on the African continent. Like actively doing it is quite new.
okay, great. I can see the questions now. Oh, and I can also hear myself. I'll just carry on with the next one. So what are next steps? What are the next steps for the IGA in Africa? And that is from Jackson Grimes.
Of course it is from Jackson Grimes. Jackson, you'll have to join our talk on the 18th. So in a nutshell, so we do it. So at the IGA, we focus a lot on training and capacity building, sustainability, sourcing finance. Now we're not financiers and we're not developers, but we can assist with sourcing finance and standards and things like that. And so a lot of the work at the moment is building our partners and networks. So we've got a lot of strategic partnerships building in South Africa in particular. We're also doing a lot of strategic partnership work in Zambia, both with the developer and operator, as well as the Zambian government and the Ministry of Energy. Basically, to manage 54 countries with our small team is quite a challenge. And so we're sort of prioritizing countries in each of those 5 regions, not because, you know, they are a priority for any particular reason or not. It's just looking at where they're at and where we might be able to contribute to progress forward. Because if you look at what's going on in Zambia at the moment, once that project is up and running, that all of those SADC nations, all of their neighbours, so Zimbabwe and Namibia and Botswana and South Africa, they're going to be jumping on it. Somebody is just waiting for that one demonstrable project to prove, like proof of concept. And so the IGA is actively involved in working with the guys in Zambia. We're also increasing our activity in Ethiopia, Algeria and Morocco in particular. I feel I may have missed a country or two, but you know, eventually we'd like to get right across the entire continent. So a lot of strategic partnerships within South Africa. South Africa is a massive energy hub for the whole SADC nations, so SADC region, I should say, so the South African developing countries. And so it's a really good base for us to work from. So we're doing a lot of conversations, raising the profile of different types of geothermal opportunities within all of those SADC energy events. We're working with the mining sector as well, because some of the world's deepest mines are on the African continent. 3.2 kilometers is a new mine near Johannesburg, and they also have 4-kilometer deep mine, and they're working below the water table. So they're having to dewater, and that water is warm, and currently it's treated as a waste product. So we're working with the mining sector as well across the African continent to see how that can feed into their operations or their environmental and social government and their corporate social responsibility. And I know some people are probably sat out there thinking, oh, that's a bit of greenwashing. To be fair, I've engaged a lot with the mining sector across the African continent in recent years, and they're actually really on it with respect to net zero mines and reduction of their carbon footprint, and because they want to, because they need to, not because they want to get carbon credits or SDG credits or anything like that. It's because they recognize that they need to improve the industry, because the mining sector is going nowhere. We need the mining sector for the energy transition. So they're very aware that they need to do better. And so we're helping them with that a little bit as well.
Oh, and we've got another question just come in. So do you have financiers who can finance geothermal drilling? And that's a question from George.
George Opio.
George
so as
Opio,
I said earlier, the IGA ourselves, we are not financiers. We are hoping to set up an impact fund at the end, towards the end, at some point this year. So we've got the Global Impact Summit next month, and one of our sort of calls to action is an impact fund. Now, what that impact fund will look like, whether that will be managed by the IGA or by or whether we'll outsource that, I don't know. And whether that'll look at impact with respect to like the direct use impacts of geothermal, so actually funding an agricultural project, for example, and whether that will entail various stages to get to that final output, we still haven't decided on. For drilling, I mean, for early stage drilling, you have the geothermal risk mitigation facility, which is, it's been predominantly geared up for development in East Africa, and I think they're going to try and do some updates to it so it's more applicable to the potential resource development across the continent and not just volcanics and that high temperature system. But they do mainly early stage drilling, so exploratory drilling, And to join the geothermal risk mitigation facility, the request has to come from a government level. So a country needs to get that, to sort of get their government to request to be a member. Now, Ethiopia, Kenya, Malawi, Zambia, and a few other countries are already members. And you can go onto their website and see if your country is a member, and if not, and you think reading up it's worth it, then it's worth reaching out to your managers, or if you're in touch with the Ministry of Energy, for example, and raise the profile of this facility as well. But for actual sort of the development of production wells and injection wells, financing is really going to come, it usually comes from the likes of government funding or public-private partnerships, where it'll be part funded by your government, so your public entity, and then a private entity, or somewhere, or other public funders like United Nations or World Bank or Africa Bank, things like that. And trying to get that early investment is always a challenge, and it's something that we all need to work on. How do we encourage that financial investment at the early stages when the risk is the highest?
Okay, great. That looks like all the questions have been covered so far, and that means we're actually keeping to time really well. So yeah, thank you so much, Helen, again for the presentation, and also highlighting on upcoming talks. On the same topic, I just wanted to also talk about an upcoming WING UK talk. So am I sharing my screen? Let me just share my screen. Okay, I am. Helen, do you think you could let me know once everyone
can see it.
Yep,
Yeah,
you
I
can see it. Okay, great. So yeah, great. So later this month, or at the end of April, we'll be joined by Neil from Erdwerk, and he'll be giving us some insights into the German geothermal market, which is very interesting, as they are quite big and leading in Europe. So yeah, I think all of the invites will be coming out on LinkedIn, social media, probably in the coming week. So please, everyone, look out for that. So yes, thank you. Thanks again for attending, to all the attendees, and to Helen for presenting. And I think we can leave it here.
Thanks,
Great.
everyone. Thanks, Simon.
Thank you. Bye. Bye all.